Please be seated. The court is now back in session. And once again, the floor is given to Nuon Chi's defense to put further questions to the witness Steve Hedder. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. Hedder. I am going to change my ways of questioning you. What I will do is read you a passage from your book, from your article, I'm sorry. More precisely, your article, Racism, Marxism, Labeling and Genocide. I will ask the President's leave to have the court officer give you a copy of this specific article. What I will do is I will read from this article after having given all ERN numbers 11 passages, and then I'm going to ask a very interesting question whether you wrote it, and I'm going to ask whether you have direct factual information without expressing an opinion or speculating, whether you have any other factual information to corroborate this particular passage. You get my drift, Mr. Hedder.
President, court officer, could you deliver the document from the counsel for the witness examination?
I will start with my first quote from document E131/1/13.3. As mentioned, it's your article, Racism, Marxism, Labeling and Genocide in Ben Keenan's The Pol Pot Regime. I would like to start with page 4 of your article, English ERN 00773. 703, French 00802-801, Khmer 00844, 553 till 54. If everything goes well, will also appear on the screen. You write, and I quote, as follows: while challenging his theoretical and historical categories, this review also confronts Keenan's conclusions by re-examining many of the same sources and same kinds of sources used by him. These include interviews of Cambodians who were CPK members when it was in power, from whom this reviewer, like Keenan, interviewed in considerable numbers in the first years after the collapse of the DK regime. They also include confessions extracted from Perth CPK cadre by interrogators of the National CPK Security Service S21, Tol Sleng, and maintained after 1979 in the archives of the Tol Sleng Genocide Museum, in which Keenan and this reviewer have conducted research on numerous occasions since 1980. Re-examination of these sources suggests that Keenan's use of the confessions is patchy and selective, and that his use of interview material is sometimes tendentious. This review also raises questions about selectivity in Keenan's use of non-confession documentary evidence and about the accuracy of his translations. It points the need for readers to be cautious, not only with regard to Keenan's arguments and conclusions, but also to the data presented to buttress them. Mr. Hedder, did you write this?
Yes.
Would you be able to expand on the words patchy and selective? Never mind. I continue.
No, I object.
No, I don't even ask the question. Mr. Hedder, relying on direct factual information without expressing an opinion or speculating, is there any other factual information as to the information that I just read to you?
President, the prosecution, you may proceed.
Mr. President, this is Mr. Hedder's book or article commenting on Mr. Kiernan's book. You are not, in my respectful submission, going to be assisted in hearing what Mr. Hedder has to say about Mr. Kiernan's book and Mr. Kiernan's use of his sources. It goes back to exactly the same point that Judge Laverne has now, on behalf of the trial chamber, ruled upon on 2 occasions in the 20 minutes before we took lunch. Also, the extract that was read was not supported by a footnote. If you look at footnote 5 on page 5, that's the footnote. So the portion that's been read to Mr. Hedder, inadmissible though it is in my submission anyway, is not even supported by a footnote upon which evidence can be given. So I object on both those grounds. If you're quoting an extract, make it relevant and give a footnote. But you hearing what Mr. Hedder has to say about what Mr. Kiernan's research methods are is expert evidence. It's inadmissible, it's irrelevant, and I object.
I read a passage. I asked the question, did you write this? And I quoted the exact same question line of the prosecutor. Please tell me what I'm doing wrong.
President, the objection at its ground raised by the prosecution to the last question put to the witness by the defense counsel for Nuon Chea is appropriate. Thus sustained. Witness, you are directed not to respond to that last question. And defense counsel, please move on to another question.
Next quote, Mr. Hedder, is from the same article. This time it is on page 24. English ERN 00773723, French 008021 up until 811, and Khmer 008445571. In this regard, Kiernan collates the wide variety of contemporary and subsequent accounts that demonstrate that up until that purge, conditions in the East Zone were generally and relatively speaking less bad and deteriorated less rapidly than in most other parts of Cambodia. It seems plausible to attribute the difference, at least in part, to the leadership style and political proclivities of East Zone Secretary Sao Pim. However, in comparing the East with other CPK structures and leaders, particularly the Southwest Zone of Tamok, Keenan overdraws his case and essentializes that these structures to give him a false coherence, putting himself through numerous convolutions in order to do so. His construct of the East Zone as a moderate pro-Vietnamese, possibly even orthodox Marxist entity is tautologically dependent on its cadre and geographical subdivisions being East Zone only.
President, witness, please wait. There is no French translation. Court officer, could you check with the ITU?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. President, I have another issue here. I do not have the proper ERN in French, or in any case, the ERN provided by the interpreter is not the correct one. So could you please repeat the French ERN?
(00802-810) up until 811. So 810, 811. I'll read it again, Mr. Header. Oh, okay. In this regard, Keenan collates the wide variety of contemporary and subsequent accounts that demonstrate that up until that purge, conditions in the East Zone were generally and relatively speaking less bad and deteriorated less rapidly than in most other parts of Cambodia. It seems plausible to attribute this difference, at least in part, to the leadership style and political proclivities of East Zone Secretary Sao Pim. However, in comparing the East with other CPK structures and leaders, particularly the Southwest Zone of Tamok, Keenan overdraws his case and essentializes these structures to give them a false coherence, putting himself through numerous convolutions in order to do so. His construct of the East Zone as a moderate pro-Vietnamese, possibly even orthodox Marxist entity, is tautologically dependent on its cadre and geographical subdivisions, being East Zone only when some evidence can be found to substantiate the characterization. It also relies on testimony from former East Zone cadre about animosity between them and cadre from other zones, particularly the Southwest. Did you write this, Mr. Header?
Yes.
President, it seems that the approach of questioning by the Defense Counsel remains unchanged. And of course, when there is an objection, you said that you would reformulate your questions, and of course you know clearly the status of this witness. He is not an expert, he is a witness before this chamber.
I simply read a passage from his book and asked the witness if he wrote it. Nothing else. Did he answer the question? And now I'm asking not to comment on Keenan. I'm not interested in that. But just if you be able to give direct factual information without expressing an opinion or speculating whether there is any other factual information as to this particular passage.
Mr. President, I don't know if I'm missing something, and I don't know if this comes from lack of experience or what. You've ruled on about 4 occasions now. Can I explain this? Again, this book, or this article, is Mr. Hedder commenting on Mr. Kiernan's book. The passage that has been confirmed is about Mr. Kiernan's comparison of structures and leaders in one zone with another. It's about an opinion being expressed that Kiernan overdraws his case. It's making reference to numerous convolutions. It's making reference to an opinion that something is a construct. It's making reference to something being plausible, which is an expression of opinion. It's not allowed, in accordance with your ruling, repeated on 4 occasions. Now, can I make this general observation? I anticipate that it will be my respectful submission that most, if not all, questions the defence ask based on a book where Mr. Hedder is expressing his opinion on what Mr. Kiernan thinks, or what Mr. Kiernan wrote, or what Mr. Kiernan opines, is inadmissible. Now, why is the message not getting through?
I'm doing the exact same thing as the prosecutor has been doing. Reading a passage from an article, asking the witness, did he write it, and then asking him for factual information to possibly corroborate yes or no. I'm not asking about his opinion about Mr. Kiernan, I'm just reading the passage. I'm doing the exact same thing as the prosecutor.
President, I would like to give the floor to Judge Cartwright to rule on this issue once and for all.
Thank you, President. The Chamber accepts the prosecutor's submission that it has made multiple rulings on this precise matter. The issue is this. The material on which Mr. Hedder was commenting in his article is not relevant to our inquiries. So please, no more questions based on this article, which in any event was presumably written by Mr. Hedder in his capacity as an expert. And he is appearing today as a witness to testify as to what he, as a witness, saw, heard, observed during the period that the Chamber is concerned with. No more questions based on this article. Thank you.
Mr. Hedder, have you done any research? Have you read articles, written articles on events that happened in the East Zone in 1975?
I certainly have interview material on that. I've not written anything. It's alluded to in here, I believe, in this review article, and there may be some allusions to it elsewhere, but in terms of a substantial, focused piece of academic work, no. The research is there. The article or the book remains to be written.
Have you done specific research on matters of security within the East Zone, questions relating to members, DK cadres of the East Zone?
Yes?
Would you be able to tell us what your research has provided?
Yes, the security office structure and hierarchy in the East was broadly similar to what it was elsewhere. That is to say, there was a zone security office, which somewhat as was the case in Phnom Penh, at the center, that is, at S21, was a kind of integral part or subordinate piece of the general staff, such that the zone security office, coded S79, was directly subordinated to the East Zone General Staff, which was seated in Prey Vang, provincial town of Prey Vang Province. And like S21 in the center, initially dealt, if not primarily, then largely with military personnel from within the Khmer Rouge's own ranks, in this case the East Zone ranks, East Zone military ranks as opposed to the National Armed Forces, and subsequently primarily with East Zone cadre. Further down the line, as elsewhere, there were security offices at the sector, in every sector, and in every district. As was true in other parts of the country, although rather inconsistently, there was often a linkage of some kind between the sector or district security office and the armed forces at those levels. That is to say, the sector army, the district army, or an interpenetration of the cadre, such that the chairperson of a security office would be a former, sometimes disabilitated military cadre. In other instances, the chairpersons of these offices were former heads of leading cadres' bodyguard units, the so-called defense units. And as was true generally throughout the country, the further one went down this formal security office structure, the more the security offices dealt with ordinary people, and the more, generally speaking, decisions about executions of people detained were primarily made at the district level, sometimes in consultation in formal terms, at least with the sector. And then beneath all of that was the cooperative or sub-district level militia, the guerrillas, to use the conventional FBIS translation, the chlope, sometimes just rendered in English to sort of add to the aura of the word, who, as elsewhere in the country, arrested people, sometimes killed them themselves. So it's not in overall, put it the other way, I put it positively, again, in overall structure and organization, very similar to what existed elsewhere. I can add that at the sector level, the security office answers normally directly to the party secretary, sometimes the party secretary's deputy, and at the district level, the same pattern generally seems to have obtained.
In your research, have you found any factual information indicating that the policy, the general policy of the CPK was executed in the East Zone in the same manner as in other zones?
Mr. President, I only object to the way in which the question is being asked. It's been broadly, in terms of this introduction, in your research. You may recall when I used the word research on day 2 of my examination, there were 2 objections. You will recall that in my questioning I raised interviews that Mr. Hedder had conducted or from any other direct factual information, but to use research in my respectful submission is too broad and invites almost inevitable opinion evidence.
I will rephrase. In your interviews and reading of documents, do you have factual information which indicates that the execution of a general CPK policy in the East Zone was the same as in other zones?
I believe the answer appears on many T-shirts. Same, but better. In the sense that policy was implemented in a manner that was more in line with what was on the face of center policy. So that the relative moderation that I mentioned elsewhere in the article, the review article, can be attributed to adherence to that center policy on the face of it, rather than attributed to a deviation from it. But with that caveat, the answer is still yes, that there were widespread executions, maybe not as widespread as in some other places, and executions for the same kinds of reasons and through the same kinds of processes that took place elsewhere in the country.
The interviews that you had, the documents that you studied, did they provide you with factual information as to who in the East Zone was responsible for these executions?
Responsible is a big word. I certainly have data from interviews over the years that identifies by name some of the members of the security office, the members of the General Staff Committee East Zone level, the names of chairpersons of sector and district security offices, and there is data in the interviews in at least some instances that says that their formal positions included actual authority commensurate with their formal positions.
Are you able to tell us from your interviews and the studying of the documents what role, if any, Sao Pim played?
Well, I think that the formal notion according to which the Secretary of a zone was in overall charge of all affairs in the zone is sustained in broad strokes by the interview information and the non-confession documentary information, such as it's available. So, in that regard, in general terms, he seems to have exercised the kind of authority over the zonal security apparatus that was indicated by his formal position, and thereby indirectly over more local security offices, again with the caveat that to the extent that non-confession data or material, I avoid using the word evidence, is available, it does not seem to be the case that the formal requirement that all executions right down to the very lowest levels in the so-called grassroots, or if you prefer, in the bases, to use a more literal translation, that all of those executions were decided by the standing committee of the zone committee. That does not appear to have been the case in the East Zone, generally speaking, as it was not generally the case in any of the other zones either.
Do you have any factual information coming from your interviews or your studying of the documents about the role of East Zone troops during the evacuation of Phnom Penh?
The President. Witness, please hold on. Mr. Prosecutor, you may proceed.
Mr. President, I just want to go back to the parameters of Mr. Hedder's evidence. I've set this out before in terms of the memorandum that was circulated by the court, and indeed, Honourable Judge Cartwright has also referred to this. The clearest exposition was in the email of the 3rd of July. The question shall be directed primarily to evidence the witness gathered either during the interviews he conducted or the evidence he accumulated during the research, and these words I underline, which forms the basis for the books or articles authored by him. The point I'm making is that for the last, I think, 4 questions, there's been no reference to any part of any book. There's been no reference to any book or extract from a book authored by Mr. Hedder. Now, the risk this presents has been illustrated by the last answer. Mr. Hedder was talking about non-confession documentary information. and use this phrase, and this is why these questions have to be so tightly framed. And it was about Sao Pim. In general terms, he seems to have exercised authority. Now, when we start using those phrases, in general terms, he seems to have, we're getting into opinion evidence. So, I do object to broad sweeping references to broad sweeping research or interviews without any specific reference to any passage that Mr. Hedder has authored. Now, the reason my examination was so tightly prepared was for every question I asked, there was an introduction by reference to an extract from a book that Mr. Hedder had authored. And that meant that when I asked in the supplemental question, is there other interview material or factual information to corroborate, you as the judges were able to have a piece of information authored by Mr. Hedder as your starting point. But when the starting point is, in effect, and I understand why, and I don't blame my learned friend for it, but when the starting point for the questions is a fishing expedition into Mr. Hedder's brain, we have real risks of opinion evidence being extracted. That risk is lessened, if not obviated, when there is a specific passage put to Mr. Hedder from a book, because you're then grounding yourself in Mr. Hedder. You're grounding yourself in accordance with your own direction in books authored by him. But if we proceed for the rest of this afternoon with fishing expedition questions with no reference, it is inevitable, in my respectful submission, that we will be in opinion territory as illustrated by the last answer. So I ask that Mr. Koppe be directed to ensure that his questioning attaches to quote your direction, a book authored by Mr. Hedder or other material.
I'm not allowed to use Mr. Hedder's book. I ask questions based on his factual knowledge. That is not allowed. But let me translate for the public what's really happening here, so that they understand this objection of the prosecution. I'm entering a territory that the prosecution wants to stay away as far as possible from. And we all know what area in the 75-79 decade period we are not allowed to enter. And that is the things that happened in the East Zone. I think I'm perfectly entitled to ask questions relating to the studying of documents and interviews done by the witness about what he can tell us as a witness about what happened in the East Zone. So this objection is not about technicalities. Don't let the public not be fooled by this. This is about me entering the East Zone and the things that happened in the East Zone.
Well, can I respond just very briefly? Counsel makes submissions to judges. Counsel do not showboat for the public. This is not about politics, this is about evidence. Had we been talking about a totally different subject, I would have made the same objection. But please, counsel needs to be told it's not his function to explain your rulings to the public. His function is to make legal submissions to you.
The President, I hand over the floor to Judge Silver Cartwright to clarify the ruling of the Chamber concerning the rule governing the examination of the testimony of this witness. Judge Cartwright, you may proceed, please.
Thank you, President. The Chamber reiterates its many rulings on this topic, and contrary to what you have indicated, Mr. Korpi, the rulings are concerned with ensuring that this witness gives testimony as a witness and not as an expert. In fact, you were the first to insist on this when Mr. Heder first started giving his testimony, and the Chamber agrees with you on that topic. Please comply with the ruling that the Chamber gave in the message quoted by the prosecutors. And if you cannot do that, then the President has asked me to indicate that as so many of the questions are not relevant, he may turn instead to Kyo Sampon and give the floor to him. Thank you, Mr. Korpi.
I will give it another and last try. I'm now going, Mr. Heder, to an article that you wrote. It's called Reassessing the Role of Senior Leaders and Local Officials in Democratic Kampuchea Crimes. Cambodian Accountability in Comparative Perspective. I think you have it there. It is E190.1.398. More specifically, Mr. Heder, I'm referring to a page in your article. ERN English 00661490. For you it is page 36. More specifically, I will refer you to footnote 207. It is French ERN 00792948. 49, I have to say, I think. Khmer 00830815 till 16. So it's all relating to footnote 207. I'm happy to read to you what is footnote 207 relating to, but I'm sure I will meet another objection. So I will just read to you the footnote 207. And I remind the Chamber that I'm reading from a public document, a publicly available document. Various evidence implicates Heng Samrin in war crimes, massacres of Vietnamese civilians, committed by troops under his command during cross-border raids into Vietnam in 1977. Now you refer to your other book, page 142 and 143. Did you in fact write this footnote, Mr. Heder?
Yes.
Would you be able to explain what you meant, what you mean with this footnote?
If I recall correctly, at this point in time, I'm referring to some interview material and maybe some confession material, probably also some confession material.
Do you know which confession material and which interviews you are referring to? Sorry.
It should be in the other article, the review article. Unfortunately, the review article has been retyped, so it doesn't have the same pagination as is in these footnotes. So I would have to leaf through this in order to try and figure out what's referred to, what the reference back to this article, review article, is.
So you cannot say right now at this point which specific interviews, which specific documents, etc. You refer to in this particular footnote. Is that correct?
Well, if we follow the footnotes, we should be able to find it. Follow the footnotes back as far as they will take us.
Maybe, Mr. Hedder, would be an idea if you could have a look at it in the break.
I think it's pages 53 and 54 of the review article. And this is based on, actually in part on Vietnamese documents identifying the unit involved, and in part on interview data identifying Heng Sam Rin as in charge of that unit. And putting those two facts together puts him in command of the unit that is identified as having carried out the attacks. And I think there's also then the inadmissible citations to confessions. It goes on for several pages, so it starts on page 53 and it runs through to page 58, but I can't link, because of the change in the pagination, I can't be absolutely sure which exact passages in the review article are referred to in the book chapter. That's the reassessing document. It bears saying, I suppose, that those kinds of data, again, I will remain neutral on the question of whether the data constitutes what other people in this room would call evidence. That kind of data is also available in subsequent Vietnamese publications or semi-publications and subsequent interviews done by me. So I don't feel uncomfortable about standing by what was based earlier on less data and is based on now on more data than back then.
I would like to turn your attention now, Mr. Hedder, to some passages in the book of Ben Kiernan. Document E3/1593. I have a copy for you in respect of the relevant passages that I would like to read to you. I would like I would like to read a few quotes. I would like to start with the first quote from this book, and it is on English, page 00678-528 and 9, French ERN 00638-799, Khmer 00637-460. For you, it is page 67 of Ben Kiernan's book. I would like, with your leave, Mr. President, to present a copy.
Counsel, please hold on. The President, the Chamber has already ruled on this issue that the Council must not base on a book by Ben Kiernan as the basis for his questioning. And the Chamber reiterates once again that if you do not have any substantive question that may be necessary for this questioning in the interest of defending your client, then the Chamber will grant the floor to the defense team for Mr. Keo Sampon, because you have to make sure that you make the best use of the time allocated. And the Chamber is of the view that you are not making a good use of the court time, and for this reason, if necessary, the Chamber will cede the floor to the defense team for Mr. Keo Sampon if you do not have any further substantive question.
So now you're saying I'm also not allowed to use Ben Kiernan's book and ask factual questions to the witness? I mean, I'm really losing it now, Mr. President. This is Ben Kiernan's book. The prosecution has asked several questions in relation to this book. I have some questions on factual information in this book, and I was hoping the witness could, yes or no, corroborate these passages, factual passages, or about events in 1975 from his own interviews and document studying. So I'm now exactly within the realm of how you think I should interview this witness. So it was my point to quote one passage of events in May 1975 and ask the witness if he has himself any factual knowledge coming from interviews or documents which could corroborate this. So no opinion, no Kiernan disqualification, just the usage of his book. More specifically, I'm asking about the evacuation of Phnom Penh in 1975. I'll be asking questions about a meeting at 20 May 1975, which has been the subject earlier of the same questions from, I think, the lead co-lawyers. So now I'm at a loss, Mr. President.
President, the prosecution, you may take the floor.
Mr. President, only to say that when I was examining Mr. Hedder on Mr. Kiernan material, I was referring to how Pol Pot came to power. The reason I referred to that book was Mr. Hedder had himself referenced Mr. Kiernan in one of his footnotes. But I think, in fairness to my learned friend, that was not always the case, and I recall asking some general questions of Mr. Hedder about Karachi in 1973, basing it on Mr. Hedder's book. I think that's the only example where I used it, but I don't object wholly to this. If there's a nexus Mr. Copy makes between this subject matter and the issues in the trial, then for my part, and I don't wish to disrespect for the ruling, but for my part, I have no objection.
President, I'd like to give the floor to Judge Cartwright. Judge Cartwright, please go ahead.
Mr. Corpy, the Chamber intervened previously because that was not the manner in which you put the question to Mr. Hedder. Rather, your subsequent explanation changed the basis on which you would put the questions. You are entitled to ask this witness questions of fact. You are not allowed to ask him to give his opinion on someone else's opinion. So if you can confine yourself to questions of fact, you may put the question to Mr. Hedder.
But I hadn't even asked the question, Judge Cartwright.
Well, look, just please, you are in serious danger of losing the rest of your time. Please just get to the question that you wish to ask. Thank you.
English ERN 00678-529. French ERN 00638-799. Khmer 00637-460. It is in relation to Mr. Hedder for you. I don't know if you have the court officer hasn't given it to you.
President, court officer, could you deliver the document from the defense counsel for the witness examination?
Page 67, Mr. Hedder. Heng Samrin was born in 1934, the third of 8 children. A few sentences down the line, in 1962-63 he met Pol Pot in both locations. A little further down the line, in that same paragraph, he then volunteered for the officer corps of the burgeoning Revolutionary Army and became a company commander. His promotion to command of the 126th Regiment and his prominent role in the capture of Nier Leung and Phnom Penh would not end his opposition to forces aligned with the center. Now, Mr. Head, I'm only asking you about factual information in relation to this specific passage. Without expressing any opinion or speculating, is there any factual information that you have which corroborates this particular passage?
In general terms, yes. I can't say that off the top of my head I'm absolutely clear that the regimental designation is the correct one. But it certainly was a regiment. One could quibble about the use of the word command. Technically, within the CPK structure, the party secretary was not the military commander of a unit. It was usually the deputy party secretary of a unit who was the military commander. But yes, in general terms, it's in agreement with what I know from interviews and non-confession documents.
Let me move now, Mr. Hedder, to page 31 of this same book. English ERN 00678510, French 006387587762, Khmer 006374006. At the passage, the surrender, I read to you as follows. I quote, Heng Samrin was ordered to send his troops to fight their way into Phnom Penh. They led one of 3 thrusts from the east. The 126th, along with the 173rd and 160th regiments, made up the Eastern Zone's 1st Division, deployed southeast of Phnom Penh. Its commander was a veteran revolutionary, the 173rd's Chance Chakray. Samrin was his deputy. The 2nd Zone Division, commanded by Samrin's younger brother, Heng Tal, fought through the east bank of the Mekong, opposite the capital. The 3rd, which included Marines, advanced along the west bank under the command of a former teacher named Chin. These Eastern Zone divisions would soon distinguish themselves from other CPK units. Their more moderate behavior won them the reputation of Sihanoutists. End of quote. Just solely in respect of the factual things being said in this quote, do you have, based on your research, based on your interviews, documents, have factual information which corroborates this particular passage in the book?
Some yes and some no. Again, I'm not sure my information gives exactly the same designations to the regiments of East Zone Division 1. Again, with the caveat about the distinction between military commander and party secretary. The secretary of Division 1 was John Jacquet. The brother of Heng Samrin, I would quibble about the name. It's T-A-L, not T-H-A-L. Tal, not Tal. And again, he was party secretary, not military commander as such. And my recollection of what I have been told is that Division 3, maybe some elements of Division 3 were involved in the attack on Phnom Penh or the advance into Phnom Penh, but most of Division 3 actually was assigned to Svayriang and provincial town and entered, seized, if you'll excuse that translation, seized Svayriang provincial town and was bivouacked there. So in broad terms, yes, on certain maybe petty issues of detail, I have some quibbles.
Thank you. Now, two quotes together, two passages together from that same book. I'm now for you on pages 55 and 57. I will start with 55.
President, Council, please wait. Mr. Steve Haddad, you may take the floor.
The other, I'm sorry, I was dealing with sort of strictly structural and organizational questions. I wouldn't fully agree with the last sentence about the East Zone divisions distinguishing themselves from all other units by their moderation. I think the picture was much more mixed and complicated than that. Some of these among the divisions that came into Phnom Penh from each of the zones, specific assignments were given to particular units. So some units were assigned to carry out executions. Some units were assigned to gather up war booty, and other units were assigned to do patrolling. And I think that was pretty much the same pattern across all the zones. And 2.5 to 3 or 2 and a part to 3 divisions was a fairly standard formation for entry into Phnom Penh. So the distinction from one unit to the next was not as a result of its zonal subordination, but the result of the specific tasking it was given by the zone secretary and or the zone chairman of general staff.
President, thank you. The time is appropriate for a short break. We will take a break now and return at 3:05. Court officer, could you assist the witness during the break and have him return to the courtroom at 3:05? The court is now in recess.